It was a Thursday night in late October 2017. The kind of night where the chill in the air hinted at the coming winter. I had met my friends, Lisa and Maria, for a few drinks at O'Malley's, a dimly lit Irish pub on the edge of town. The town being the somewhat sleepy suburb of Elmwood, Illinois. We'd known each other since high school, and these occasional nights out were our way of staying connected, of clinging to a shared past in the face of our increasingly divergent lives. I wasn't much of a drinker, so after 2 glasses of wine, I was ready to call it a night. Lisa and Maria decided to stay, their laughter echoing in the near-empty pub as I walked out into the cool night air. The parking lot was mostly deserted, the yellow sodium lights casting long, distorted shadows. I remember feeling a slight twinge of unease, the kind you get when you're alone in a dark, empty place, but I brushed it off. I was probably just tired and a little tipsy. I got into my car, a beat-up Honda Civic that had seen better days, and started the engine. The familiar rumble was comforting. I pulled out of the parking lot and onto Maple Street, the main road leading out of town. The streets were quiet, the houses dark, everyone tucked away in their beds. After a few minutes, the road merged into the highway, a long, straight stretch of asphalt that cut through the flat, Illinois farmland. It was then that I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. Just a single pair, at first, far in the distance. They were approaching at a steady pace, slightly faster than mine. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a highway, after all. People were bound to be driving. But as the car behind me drew closer, I started to feel a knot of apprehension in my stomach. It was the way it was driving, I think. Steady, purposeful, like it was focused solely on me. I sped up a little, but the car behind me mirrored my movements, maintaining a constant distance. My pulse quickened. Then, the car signaled a lane change. Relief washed over me. It was just going to pass. I slowed down slightly, giving it room. But instead of passing, the car swerved back behind me, pulling up so close that I could feel the heat of its headlights on my back. Then, the brights flashed. My heart leaped into my throat. Panic surged through me, hot and prickly. What was going on? Was this some kind of road rage incident? I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The brights dimmed for a moment, then flashed again, even brighter this time. The car behind me surged forward, its engine roaring like a wild animal. I struggled to keep my eyes on the road, fighting the urge to look back at the car behind me. My mind raced, conjuring up all sorts of terrifying scenarios. Was it a drunk driver? A psychopath? Someone I knew? The possibilities seemed endless, and each one was more horrifying than the last. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw my exit, Willow Creek Drive. I took the exit at a speed that was probably reckless, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away from that car. But as I turned onto Willow Creek, the car followed, its brights flashing intermittently, like some kind of demented Morse code. My fear was now a cold, hard knot in my chest. I was no longer on a highway. This was my neighborhood, my street. Every stop sign, every turn, it was still there. Relentless shadow. I sped through a yellow light, ignoring the voice in my head that told me to be careful. I was beyond careful. I was terrified. My house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, a small, 2-story colonial with a detached garage. I pulled into the driveway, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key out of the ignition. I knew my only hope was to make a run for the house and call the police. As I fumbled with my keys and threw open the car door, I heard the screech of tires behind me. The other car had pulled in behind mine, blocking my escape. The driver's side door flew open, and a man leaped out, sprinting towards me. "Lock your car and call 911, he yelled, his voice hoarse with urgency. "Call the police." I was frozen, caught between terror and confusion. This man, my pursuer, was telling me to call the police? It didn't make any sense, but there was something in his eyes, a desperate plea, that made me believe him. I scrambled back into my car, locked the doors, and dialed 911, my fingers trembling on the keypad. I could hear the man outside, shouting, banging on the hood of my car. It all felt surreal, like a scene from a movie, not something that was happening to me in my own driveway. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the night. They apprehended the man easily enough. He didn't resist. He just stood there, looking at me with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It was only then, under the harsh glare of the police car's headlights, that the horrifying truth was revealed. As the man, whose name was David, had pulled up behind me on the highway, his headlights had illuminated the interior of my car. He had seen a figure, a man, rising up from my back seat, a butcher knife glinting in his hand. He had flashed his brights, and the figure had crouched back down. David, a complete stranger, had been trying to save my life. He had followed me, flashing his lights, hoping to scare off my attacker, hoping to keep me safe until I reached a place where he could help me. The police searched my car and found him, a young man, barely older than a teenager, hiding under a blanket in the back. He was a local kid with a history of mental illness. He had apparently broken into my car while it was parked at O'Malley's, planning to rob me, or worse. The following days were a blur of police statements and media attention. I was labeled a lucky survivor, but I didn't feel lucky. I felt violated, terrified, and deeply, profoundly shaken. The thought that someone had been in my car, inches away from me with a weapon, was almost too much to bear. I had nightmares for months. Every time I got into my car, I would check the back seat, even though I knew it was irrational. The experience changed me. It shattered my sense of security, my belief that I was safe in my own little world. It made me realize how fragile life is, how quickly it can be snatched away. The October air hung thick and heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and the promise of an early frost. It was 2008, and the world felt like it was holding its breath, teetering on the edge of some unseen precipice. But all I could think about was Sarah Jenkins, with her sun-streaked hair and eyes that held the vastness of a twilight sky. That Friday night, under a canopy of indifferent stars, I was determined to make her see me, really see me, beyond the awkward fumblings of a 17-year-old boy desperate for connection. Our destination was Parker's Point, a secluded overlook above Havenwood, Ohio, notorious as the local lover's lane. It was a place whispered about in hushed tones, a dark haven where secrets were shared and boundaries were tested. I borrowed my dad's hulking Ford Taurus, a relic from a bygone era that reeked of stale memories and lost dreams. But it was my chariot, my vessel to a night I hoped would change everything. We parked at the precipice. The town lights spread out below us like a spilled jewel box. The radio played a soft, bluesy tune, a soundtrack to the nervous flutter in my chest. Sarah seemed on edge, her gaze flitting nervously to the impenetrable darkness of the woods that pressed in on us, a living entity with its own secrets. "Hey," I murmured, leaning in, my voice a rough caress in the stillness. "It's okay. We're alone." My fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead, and then, driven by a surge of youthful recklessness, I kissed her. It was a tentative touch, a question posed in the language of longing, and she answered, her lips soft and yielding beneath mine. For a moment, the world outside the car dissolved, leaving only the hushed intimacy of our shared breath and the frantic rhythm of my heart. Then, the music died. Not just stopped, but choked off, as if a hand had clamped over its mouth. The silence that followed was a suffocating presence. And then, a voice, gravelly and laced with a chilling urgency, sliced through the stillness. "This is an emergency broadcast. Convicted murderer Richard Cutter has escaped from the Crestwood Mental Institution earlier this evening." Crestwood. The name was a cold stone in the pit of my stomach. It was practically on the outskirts of Havenwood, a stone's throw from our precarious perch on the edge of darkness. The announcer's voice droned on, each word a hammer blow against the fragile shell of our stolen moment. "Cutter is considered extremely dangerous. He is 6 feet tall, approximately 180 pounds, with short brown hair. His right hand is missing, replaced by a stainless steel hook. A hook. The image seared itself into my brain. A grotesque parody of a hand, cold, sharp, and utterly inhuman. Beside me, Sarah had gone rigid, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Mark," she whispered, the sound barely audible above the frantic thumping of my heart. I don't like this. Let's go. A part of me, the primal, instinctual part, screamed in agreement. But another part, fueled by adolescent pride and a desperate need to appear fearless, resisted. It's okay, I said, my voice a hollow mockery of reassurance. We're safe. I'll just lock up. The metallic clicks of the locks echoed in the confined space, each one a futile attempt to barricade ourselves against the encroaching darkness. I tried to recapture the moment, to pull her back into the warmth of our embrace. But the magic was gone, shattered by the chilling pronouncement from the radio. Mark, please, she begged, her voice laced with a terror that was rapidly infecting me. I want to go home. Now. Her fear was a living thing, a palpable entity that slithered between us, poisoning the air. My bravado evaporated, leaving behind a residue of shame and a gnawing sense of dread. Fine, I snapped, my voice sharp with a frustration born of fear. Let's go. I threw the car into gear, the engine roaring in protest as I ripped us away from Parker's Point. The tires spat gravel, a desperate scramble to escape the unseen threat that lurked in the shadows. The drive to Sarah's house was a suffocating silence, punctuated only by the frantic thudding of my heart. Her fear clung to the air, a thick, suffocating fog. I felt like an animal caught in a trap, desperate, enraged, and utterly helpless. Her house, when we finally reached it, was a beacon of normalcy in the encroaching darkness. A quaint Victorian, bathed in the warm glow of the porch light, it seemed to mock the terror that had gripped us only moments before. Sarah practically threw herself out of the car, her movements jerky and frantic. She reached for the door handle, and then it happened. A scream, raw and primal, tore through the night. It was a sound that seemed to claw its way out of her very soul, a sound that echoed the unspeakable horror that had been lurking just beyond our perception. I scrambled out of the car, my legs heavy and unresponsive, my mind struggling to comprehend. Sarah, what is it? What's wrong? She stood there, frozen, her body trembling uncontrollably, her eyes fixed on the door handle. I followed her gaze, and the world tilted on its axis. There, dangling from the handle, gleaming malevolently in the porch light, was a hook, a stainless steel hook, its curved surface smeared with a dark, viscous substance that I knew, with a sickening certainty, was blood. The blood drained from my face, leaving me cold and clammy. My knees buckled, and I sank to the ground, the reality of our near-death experience crashing over me like a rogue wave. We had been marked, targeted. The monster had been there, inches away, his presence a silent scream in the darkness. The distant wail of sirens pierced the night, their approach a hollow comfort. Sarah's parents rushed out, their faces contorted with worry, but I could only stare at the hook, that obscene symbol of our brush with death. In the end, they caught Cutter hiding in the woods near Parker's Point. He was a broken, deranged man, more pathetic than terrifying in the harsh light of day. But the fear he had instilled in us, the chilling reality of his presence, lingered like a persistent shadow. Sarah and I never spoke of that night again. The shared trauma, instead of binding us together, drove a wedge between us, a silent chasm of unspoken fear and regret. We drifted apart, the memory of that night a dark, unspoken secret that haunted our separate paths. It was the summer of 2015, and I was 17, eager to make some extra cash before my senior year. That's how I ended up babysitting for the Millers, a well-off family in Corona del Mar, a neighborhood that practically screamed old money. Their house was a sprawling, modern monstrosity overlooking the Pacific. Think glass walls, infinity pools, and more rooms than I could count. Mr. and Mrs. Miller were headed out to a movie at Fashion Island and then dinner, the usual affluent Newport Beach night out. I knew the Miller children, 8-year-old Ethan and 6-year-old Emily, from church. They were sweet kids, if a little spoiled. That night, everything was going smoothly. We played a few rounds of Candyland. I read them a bedtime story about a princess and a dragon, and by 9:30 p.m., they were both sound asleep. Mr. Miller had instructed me to hang out in the den, a cozy room on the second floor, once the kids were down. "Don't want you wandering around," he'd said with a chuckle that I found slightly odd at the time. The den was nice enough, dominated by a huge flat-screen TV and a plush, L-shaped couch. But there was one thing that immediately caught my eye and made my skin crawl: a life-sized clown statue in the corner. It was perched on a small stool, its painted smile stretched grotesquely wide, its eyes wide and staring. The colors were garish, a jarring contrast to the room's muted tones. Honestly, it was the kind of thing you'd expect to see at a carnival, not in a multi-million-dollar home. I tried to ignore it, flipping through channels, trying to find something decent to watch. But the clown was always there, in my peripheral vision, that awful smile seeming to mock me. I shifted on the couch, pulling a throw blanket tighter around me. But it didn't help. It was like the statue was watching me. My phone showed that an hour, and then another, went by. I glanced at the clown again. This time I noticed some dust on its shoulder. Was there dust before? And why was there a small stool under the clown? Who would put a stool under a statue? A wave of unease washed over me. It was silly, I knew, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Was it just my imagination? Or did the clown's eyes seem to follow me? I started to feel a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I glanced around the room, taking in the shadows that seemed to dance in the corners. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mr. Miller's number. He answered on the third ring, sounding slightly annoyed. "Hey, Mr. Miller," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "The kids are asleep, but, would it be okay if I watch TV in a different room? This clown statue is kind of creeping me out." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, Mr. Miller spoke, his voice deadly serious. "Sarah, listen to me carefully. Get Ethan and Emily, go next door to the Johnsons, and call 911. My heart pounded in my chest. What? Why? What's going on? "Just do it, Sarah," he said urgently. "Once you've called the police, call me back." Panic seized me. I didn't waste any more time. I ran to the kids' rooms, my mind racing. Ethan was harder to rouse, but I managed to get them both up and dressed, all while trying to act like this was some sort of fun, late-night adventure. We rushed out of the house and across the lawn to the Johnsons, who, thankfully, were still awake. Mrs. Johnson, a kind woman with a worried frown, ushered us inside while I dialed 911. My hands shaking so badly I could barely press the numbers. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who assured me that officers were on their way. Once the call was over, I dialed Mr. Miller back. "The police are coming," I said, my voice trembling. "Can you please tell me what's happening?" Another silence, then Mr. Miller's voice, now filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "We don't have a clown statue, Sarah. Never did." My blood ran cold. "What?" I whispered, the word barely audible. He then told me about the children's recent complaints. They had been talking about a clown man who watched them sleep. Mr. and Mrs. Miller had dismissed it as nightmares, a childish fear of the dark. Now, the horrifying truth was becoming clear. The police arrived within minutes, sirens wailing, lights flashing. They swarmed the Miller house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Mrs. Johnson and I watched from the window, Ethan and Emily huddled between us, their eyes wide with fear. It felt like an eternity before the officers emerged, leading a figure in handcuffs. It was a man, small in stature, dressed in a filthy, tattered clown costume. His face was painted white, with a grotesque red smile that mirrored the one I had seen in the den. They called him Chuckles. He was a vagrant who had somehow infiltrated the Miller home weeks ago. The house was so large that he was able to hide in unused rooms, emerging at night to steal food and, most disturbingly, to watch the children sleep. The police later explained that Chuckles had been in the den just moments before I entered. When I turned on the TV, he didn't have time to escape, so he did the only thing he could think of. He froze, pretending to be a statue, hoping I wouldn't notice him. It was the summer of 2003. I was 11 years old, living in a quiet, two-story house on the outskirts of Ashwood, Oregon. The neighborhood was the kind where kids still played outside until the streetlights flickered on, and the loudest noise was the occasional bark of Mrs. Henderson's golden retriever, Buster. My bedroom was upstairs, a cozy space filled with the usual clutter of a preteen girl, posters of boy bands, stuffed animals, and a collection of half-finished craft projects. My parents, Sarah and David, always kept the bathroom light on, a soft, yellow glow that spilled into the hallway and served as a comforting nightlight. One humid July night, I drifted off to sleep as usual, the gentle hum of the window air conditioner a lullaby in the otherwise silent house. Hours later, a faint creak from downstairs stirred me from a dreamless slumber. It wasn't unusual to hear noises. Our old house settled and groaned like an old man in his rocking chair. I rolled over, pulling my blanket tighter, ready to fall back asleep. Then, another sound reached me, a soft thud, like something had been dropped. Slightly more alert, I listened intently. Silence. Maybe it was just Buster, I thought, though he usually slept soundly through the night. Curiosity tugged at me. It was probably nothing, but a sliver of unease began to worm its way into my drowsy mind. I sat up, pushing my blonde hair out of my eyes, and glanced towards my open bedroom door. The bathroom light was on as always, casting its familiar glow into the hallway. But something was different. A silhouette was standing in the doorway, a stark, black shape against the pale light. It was tall and still, utterly motionless. My heart gave a little jump, but I quickly rationalized it. It was probably my mom, checking on me. "Mom," I called out, my voice a little shaky, still half asleep. No answer. The figure didn't move. A tendril of doubt crept into my mind. My mom usually answered right away, even if she was just passing by. "Mom," I repeated, louder this time, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "Is that you?" Still nothing. The figure remained, a dark void in the doorway. The initial calmness was gone, replaced by a growing sense of apprehension. Why wasn't she answering? A cold knot began to form in my stomach. Panic, sharp and sudden, pierced through my fear. This wasn't my mom. My mom would have answered. My mom wouldn't just stand there, silent and unmoving. "Emoam," I screamed, my voice cracking with terror. "Emoam, come here." I scrambled back against the headboard, pulling my covers up to my chin, my eyes fixed on the doorway. The dark figure was still there, and now, in the dim light, I could make out 2 points of crimson, glowing like embers in the darkness. Eyes. They were staring at me, unblinking, malevolent. A primal fear, the kind that bypasses logic and reason, seized me. This wasn't a person. This was something else, something evil. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very oxygen had been replaced with something thick and suffocating. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, terrifying silence. I squeezed my eyes shut, burying my face in my pillow, my body trembling uncontrollably. "Mom, Dad, help me," I sobbed, my voice muffled by the fabric. Then, I heard footsteps, heavy and hurried, coming up the stairs. My mom's voice, laced with alarm, called out, "Emma, what's wrong?" The bedroom door burst open, flooding the room with light from the hallway. I cautiously peeked out from under the covers. My mom was standing there, her face etched with worry, her eyes wide with concern. Behind her, my dad appeared, his expression equally alarmed. I looked towards where the figure had been standing. It was gone. The doorway was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the bathroom light. "There was something here," I stammered, pointing a shaking finger towards the door. It was watching me." My parents exchanged a look, a mixture of confusion and concern in their eyes. They scanned the room, the hallway, but there was nothing there. "Honey, there's no one here," my mom said softly, sitting on the edge of my bed and pulling me into a hug. "You must have had a nightmare." "But the eyes," I whispered. The image of those glowing red orbs seared into my memory. It had red eyes. My dad, a practical man who believed in logic and reason, gently explained, "It was probably just a trick of the light, Emma. Shadows can play tricks on your eyes, especially when you're half asleep." They stayed with me until I eventually drifted back into a fitful sleep, but the comfort of their presence couldn't erase the terror I had felt. I knew what I had seen. It wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a trick of the light. In the following weeks, I became increasingly anxious, especially at night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sent shivers down my spine. I insisted on sleeping with my bedroom door closed, a small comfort in the face of the unknown. I started having trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of dark figures and glowing red eyes. My parents, increasingly worried, took me to see a child psychologist. Dr. Miller, a kind woman with a gentle smile, listened patiently as I described my experience. She explained that I might be suffering from night terrors, a sleep disorder that causes feelings of panic or dread. She further elaborated that night terrors typically occur during the first few hours of stage 3 to 4 non-rapid eye movement, NREM, sleep, and usually last from 1 to 10 minutes. She prescribed relaxation techniques and encouraged me to talk about my fears. But the therapy didn't help. The fear lingered, a constant shadow in the back of my mind. I knew what I had seen was real, even if no one else believed me. The experience had changed me, leaving me with a deep-seated fear of the dark, of the unseen, of the things that might be lurking just beyond the edge of my vision.